Together with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Just before we get started, a quick word about where you're sitting. I see a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience, but if you're here for the first time, this is the 50th anniversary of the Wilson Center. We were created by an act of Congress to bridge the worlds of academia, policy, and practice. President Wilson was the only president to have a PhD, so when it came time to memorialize him, they thought of a more creative way than a stone monument. So we're meant to be a living, breathing, dynamic institution that is evolving with the times and the challenges. So for more than 20 years, the Environmental Change and Security Program has been bridging these worlds specifically at the intersection of health, environment, and security. We rely on the learning of our partners, some of whom are speaking today, to inform our work and help build those bridges across diverse disciplines and sectors. A few quick logistical points. The event is being webcast live, so when we come to the Q&A portion, please be sure to wait for one of my colleagues with a mic and state your name and affiliation before getting quickly to your question. We also, we ask you to share your name and affiliation. There will be a reception following today's event across the atrium. And so I know there's a lot of information coming at you soon, and it's going to be very, I think it's going to be really informative and useful in your work, and the time for Q&A might get shorter than ideal. So I hope that you're able to join us for the reception and continue the conversation with the speakers there. I'd like to introduce Stephen Lowry, who will be moderating today's event. I don't think that we could have found a better moderator for today's event. He'll also introduce Carrie Thompson, who will be giving some welcoming remarks before we get to the panel. Dr. Lowry is the director of the Center for International Forestry Research's Equity, Gender, and Tenure Research Program. He leads scientists and research associates based at the C4 offices in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You have a short bio in front of you, but I want to highlight here that his professional experience really extends across academia as well as practice. In addition to being a former president of Antioch College, Dr. Lowry is a former senior research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, and in 2010 and 2011, he headed the USAID-funded Sudan Property Rights Program and assisted the government of South Sudan in developing a national land policy. So we have a true expert to convene today's discussion. So thank you, Dr. Lowry.
Thank you, Laura, and on behalf of all of us here, we're very grateful to the Wilson Center and to the Environmental Change and Security Program, and we think this is obviously an ideal venue and to feature the work, this important work of the 10-year and Global Climate Change Project supported by USAID. And I'm just not going to say anything more for the moment, apart from inviting Carrie Thompson to the podium. Carrie is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment. She's been with USAID for some time, has served in several senior posts in Latin America, East Africa, and more recently Asia before coming into Washington. So we're very pleased that she could be here with us today. And Carrie, I'd like to invite you to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much. Thanks to the Wilson Center and to our partners for inviting me to be here today. And thank you all for joining to mark the closing of one of USAID's flagship land and resource rights programs, the Tenure and Global Climate Change Project, or TGCC, which worked across 10 countries since its launch in 2013. At its core, TGCC is about generating knowledge. From partnering with Hershey's to test ways to improve cocoa productivity and livelihoods while strengthening tree tenure for farmers in Ghana, to exploring linkages between customary land certification and agroforestry in Zambia, the program has consistently been at the forefront of creating valuable evidence that can improve how we approach a wide variety of development challenges, including food insecurity, deforestation, and conflict over resources. I'm pleased that we have such a superb panel of experts here with us today. They're not here yet, but they will be in just a moment to share with us some of the knowledge along these lines. Their firsthand insights from activities as diverse as coastal mangrove management in Vietnam to responsible beef supply chains in Paraguay will help us draw connections and conclusions from a broad range of interventions in land policy, forest conservation, private sector engagement, and participatory mapping. It's important to note that while TGCC was centrally managed out of Washington through the Land and Urban Office and the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, all of the country activities we'll hear about today were developed and implemented in response to specific challenges that USAID field missions identified as ones that they were facing. These pilot programs were not just academic exercises, it's really important to note, but targeted efforts to develop practical approaches that USAID and our host countries and private sector partners can use in response to very real and tangible development challenges. And the results and knowledge gained from TGCC can help us at USAID and all of you to improve how we approach these challenges and achieve our ultimate objective: fostering more stable, prosperous, and self-reliant societies. So before I hand it back over to Stephen Lowry, I want to take a moment to officially thank the consortium of partners who implemented the TGCC program on behalf of USAID. Thank you, and I'm looking to the front row and to those who will come up and others in the audience. Thank you so much for all of your hard work and your superb results. I look forward to taking my chair and listening to what you have to say, to learn about all the things that we have done and learned over the past several years. So thank you very much, and I guess I'm handing it back to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, for that welcome. So the title of our program today, for those of you who haven't had a chance to revisit the list of speakers, is Land and Resource Rights for Economic Growth. As Carrie has noted, we're going to be hearing from 5 partners of the TGCC program who are members of either the project or of partner organizations to the project. And I'll be introducing each of them very briefly in turn to offer their presentations. And so you have to give me a moment just to find our first bio here. Hope they're in order. And that's Emiko. Emiko Guth, please come on up. Emiko is the Director of Tetra Tech's Technology for Development Unit. As Burma Country Coordinator for TGCC, Emiko led participatory mapping efforts, which documented community resource rights in 8 locations. She's a GIS specialist by training. Emiko supported Burma's nascent network of civil society and land advocates to build soft and hard skills required to develop an anti-SMAT. Emiko, before you come up, I see I've gotten ahead of myself here, and I apologize, because I was meant to offer some reflections on the goals of the program today. So if you'll all excuse me, I think I'll just stop ourselves heading off into the wilderness here by noting that we're here today to learn from participatory, bottom-up, and community-driven rights documentation processes to understand how land and resource rights are being documented and actualized through a number of different contexts and approaches. Cases we will hear today reflect a range of tenure conditions and uses for the participatory rights documentation process. These range from, first, household rights documentation by customary authorities in Zambia to administer household land locally, reaching over 16,000 household parcels, including 52% of the parcels registered by women, to community rights documentation in Burma by 7 communities, civil society organizations, and 59 local communities to support land use planning, facilitate government engagement, and advocate for community rights. 2, documenting overlapping resource rights to facilitate multi-stakeholder planning and mangrove management in coastal areas in Vietnam. Finally, or moreover, we'll be consolidating existing indigenous peoples' claims from across Paraguay on a shared platform so that they can advocate for the rights with private sector investors. And finally, we'll be hearing about approaches to documenting tenancy arrangements to help two of Ghana's largest private sector cocoa actors, Hershey's and Ecom Trading, better target their farm rehabilitation services. Most importantly, in each country and case, the methods used are being improved on and scaled up by other development partners, including government. The data generated is being accepted onto national and global platforms, demonstrating the value and legitimacy of bottom-up participatory rights documentation, which is a key theme of our event, from the household level to the community level and beyond. So with that introduction to the program, I'd like to invite Emiko to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon. Slides. My name is Emiko Guta. I was the country coordinator for our work in Burma, and today I'm going to give you a short overview of what we were working on in country, and starting with a little bit of background and context on Burma, describe some of our objectives and the design of the program. I'll then talk to you a little bit about our community resource documentation process and finish with some key takeaways from the overall work. Oops. Excuse me. Thanks, Matt. Is that working? Next slide, please. Okay, so our work in Burma was active from 2014 to 2017, which many of you know was a time of significant change in Burma or Myanmar. Since about 2012, Burma has been transitioning pretty significantly towards more democratic governance and also opening for investment. This rapid change has led to rising concerns over land tenure and property rights security, especially for vulnerable populations and rural communities, which comprise 70% of the country itself. The legal and policy framework that governs land in Burma is extremely complicated and often antiquated. So to address these concerns, in 2014, the government of Burma began to draft a national land use policy, or NLUP. This process was supported by USAID, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and the European Union. The process utilized an unprecedented, for Burma, inclusive public consultation process that occurred in every state and region of the country. Throughout these consultations, the policy was refined and was eventually endorsed by the government in January 2016. The NLUP is based on international good practice, such as the voluntary guidelines, and promotes sustainable land use management, protects customary tenure for ethnic minorities, and promotes people-centered development. Now, for those of you that follow Burma, you'll know that a new political party took power midway through 2016, right after the policy was endorsed, and this led to the political process being slightly stalled for most of the project timeframe. After our project concluded at the end of 2017, the government did announce a National Land Use Council, which is still taking shape today. Next slide. So this should give some background and context by which we were undertaking our work in Burma, and gives you some idea of what USAID wanted to address regarding the land tenure security and property rights concerns in country. Our program had three main objectives. The first was to support the development of laws, policies, and regulations that encourage sustainable use of land and natural resources. Next slide. Our second objective was to strengthen the land tenure, resource, and property rights of rural individuals, with particular attention to women, smallholder farmers, and ethnic minorities. And under this objective, we tested the national land use policy in practice. Next slide. Our third and final objective was to increase consultation amongst stakeholders on issues related to land tenure and land use. And this objective really underpinned all of the activities of the project, as it was fundamental, and it represents a large change for this country as well. Next slide, please. So how do we test the national land use policy in practice? Our pilot sites undertook a process called community resource documentation that used inclusive participatory methods to map and recognize customary land and resource tenure. Our pilot sites documented village resource boundaries and land uses using participatory mapping techniques that employed both low and high-tech tools. It's important to note here that participatory land use planning is not historically common in Burma, and pilot activities really help to demonstrate how to conduct participatory activities, as well as why community perspectives should be included in mapping initiatives at the national level. Next slide, please. This slide shows a map of our pilot sites where we worked in 59 villages or communities across 11 village tracts. That's the lowest administrative division in country in 4 states and regions of Burma. Of note, we worked with 7 local organizations to undertake this work. Most of these were local civil society and they were small organizations. And they worked with communities to generate mapping outputs such as spatial data, maps, and what we called village folios, which are books that document the process that the community undertook. These outputs are now housed on the platform run by the One Map Myanmar initiative. And One Map Myanmar is a broad government initiative that democratizes access to high-quality spatial data on land for more accountable and transparent development planning and governance. Next slide, please. It's important to note that our pilot site activities also included land legal awareness trainings for many of our local authorities. And our findings from these activities were a demonstration of how to include participatory bottom-up approaches to land use planning. One challenge that we faced throughout the project was that these maps currently have no pathway to legal recognition under the current legal and policy framework. So we had a lot of authorities who told us that these were interesting but not very useful for their actual outputs. However, we did find that the map outputs and the mapping process itself helped to facilitate dialogue between communities and authorities. And these are 2 groups between which there's traditionally been very little to no interaction. So this represented a large shift in mindset. Finally, we found that these events helped to raise community awareness of the pathways under which they could secure their tenure under the current legal framework. Next slide, please. As you can imagine, this work is fairly complicated and we have a lot of lessons learned, but to try to distill it down for you today, we identified 3 key takeaways from our work. The first is that there is a need to harmonize the land legal framework and to strengthen interministerial cooperation and coordination in country. Land is governed by 3 main ministries in Myanmar, or Burma, that do not have a history of collaboration and sometimes are openly not collaborating or coordinating. Our pilot sites really demonstrated some of the practical challenges of engaging in land-related decision-making at subnational levels, and also demonstrated how unclear many of the subnational level committees are on making land-related decisions. Basically, the takeaway here is that a complicated land legal framework translates to confusion on the ground as well. Our second key takeaway was that there is a very high demand for accurate and up-to-date information about the land legal framework and land rights. We recognize that the government of Burma is managing a process of change, and they openly recognize that having more informed stakeholders that resulted from our pilot sites helps to them manage this process of change. I also saw that civil society needs further capacity building to really understand the legal framework, and that communities really have no idea of how they're supposed to, what options are there for them to secure their tenure. Finally, our third key takeaway was that there's a need to continue to demonstrate this type of bottom-up and participatory approach as you'll hear from many of the countries, this is a very traditionally top-down governance structure, and there's additional work needed to show how participatory mapping can be used for decision-making in governance structures such as this. We did find that there is an emerging community of practice around participatory approaches, and there's a need to integrate these type of evidence-based approaches into other sectors such as agriculture. Finally, we tested local organizations, largely civil society organizations, as service providers, and we did see that there is more work needed on this front. Next slide, please. So in closing, we recognize that Burma is at the beginning of a long process towards improved inclusive land governance, and I look forward to your questions during the Q&A and following. Thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Amiko. So next we're going to hear from Sylvia Petrova. Sylvia is the geospatial analyst at USAID and provides geospatial analytics and technology solutions assistance to missions across land and urban portfolio and cross-sectoral programs. She focuses on the use of geospatial and technology approaches to support land and resource governance, sustainable urban services, and cross-sectoral programming for climate change, biodiversity, and food security initiatives. She's been the USAID's lead on the TGC's Vietnam work, and she'll be speaking to that work today. Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. As Steve mentioned, I was activity manager from USAID side to the work in Vietnam, and I'm presenting on behalf of the TGC team in Vietnam. So my talk will focus on the mapping resource rights to improve mangrove management in Vietnam Red Rivers Delta. Next slide, please. So why coastal area and why mangrove? Coastal areas are unique areas, and usually they contain a land outside and inside there's sea or wall, and mangrove covers most of their mud flats. In this area, there's a spatial and temporal overlap of different land resource uses, such as agriculture, aquaculture, gleaning, fishing, mangrove restoration, clam farming. The coast of Vietnam, and especially the coast along the Red River Delta, has been impacted by intensive typhoons, flooding, and sea level rise. In Vietnam, marine spatial planning is still relatively new, and most of their planning is done at our provincial level with very small input from the bottom up. Next slide, please. Also, it has to be noted that Vietnam is a top-down planning country, and most of the consultation from the local communities are not considered. But this is changing, and in recent years, the government of Vietnam has made significant efforts to create the legal framework that allow for multi-sector planning and for involvement of the local community. So I can mention only 3 laws that has been passed and introduced in the legal framework in Vietnam in the last couple of years. This is the law on sea and island natural resource and environment, which was affected since 2016 and focused on sectorial approach to sustainable development of marine resources. The decree that followed this law, Decree R119, provided policy on sustainable management production, protection, and development of the coastal forests to the response of the climate change. And finally, the planning law that was passed last year has a significant portion on the coastal special planning and being as a tool integrated and integrated tool for management of the coastal areas. Next slide. So the project was piloted in Tien Lang District, Haiphong Municipality, and in the 3 of their coastal communes. And district coastal communes, there's arrangements of the different coastal resources and different contractual management of these resources were very different. Also, it's important to notice that the district government was searching for ways how to understand the resources are managed within the district, as well to understand how to coordinate and improve these efforts. Next slide. This is just example of a couple of activities going on under piloted community. Starting from the bottom top, this is activity called gleaning, and gleaning is collecting resources from the sea through hands. This activity is mostly done by our women. Then there's fishing by hand, fishing by boats, setting traps for different marine resources, as well aquaculture and clam farming to their bottom right. They just give you a flavor of how much, how different activities are within their the piloted communities. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So our future pilot, the way how the pilot was known within the Vietnam community, started in October 2016 and finished in December 2017. And it was implemented under the Vietnam Forest and Delta, another USAID project that was operating already in the country and in the similar areas. Next slide. Thank you. The pilot developed and tested participatory special planning approaches and mangrove co-management practices to provide opportunity for the local community to provide their input to how their resources are used, how they will be used, to assess the resources, and create our future planning, to plan for the future. Next slide. Most of the participatory mapping was done through the community. Community members and local government was very deeply involved in the whole process of the community of the pilot. So they were a very important for the success of the pilot. For participatory mapping, first satellite images were used to map most of the features, such as aquaculture or mangrove, that were easy to detect through our satellite images, and using some tablets and survey forms developed from GeoODK. It's an open software for collecting data. geospatial information was collected for each of those use right groups to identify different overlaps between these user groups and to understand whether there are conflict between the users. The survey data collected information on different capital investment for each of the users, income generated from a particular activity, different contractual type, length of the contract, and productivity. Next slide. With this information was packaged into multiple maps that provided our tool to our local community and local government to discuss and understand the coastal resources, the conditions of the coastal resources and the conditions of the different users, identify different overlapping users and conflicts, as well to prepare their vision for the future and to plan for the next 10 to 15 years. On this map, I'm not sure how clear is looking at from the back of the room, but the solid colors represent a different institutions providing contracts to aquaculture ponds. And they range from provincial people's committee to district to commune people's committee. Also, there's licenses distributed to company, to single household, to subleases. And the dots, again, I'm not sure how clear is from the map, but the duration of the contract is vast. It's between 1 and 50 years. And each institution has a different multiple duration context and institutions. Next slide, please. So the maps were instrumental for all the community consultations and scenario development. Each of the workshops conducted at the commune level were using the maps. Next slide. For the first time, the communes were able to provide input on their development plans, and they were able to identify themselves what land is available for which use. So this table represents a different type of use and represent the area available for these uses for each of the commune, summing up to their district. Next slide, please. And this is not only tabular representation of what is available, but also is supported with their participatory plan for 2030, which includes not only the area where the mangrove forest will be and other coastal activity, but also included area that where the future improvements of the roads should take place, and whether there will be some tourist activity developed, ecotourism developed in one of the community. So the last slide, can we go to the next slide? Lessons. The project, the pilot, develop an extensive document on all the lessons learned through our implementation of this approach. And I will just mention a couple of them. First, participatory mapping and resource use proved to be a helpful tool for identifying overlapping rights and promoting multi-sector planning. Participation of the community, as well as the participation of different level of government, was very important for the success of the pilot. Also, participatory spatial planning engaged all social groups, women especially, And the pilot revealed that even women were responsible for planting the mangrove trees. They didn't have rights to their management and use of the mangrove as the men. The other important lesson is around the private sector. In one of the commune, there was a private sector activity holding of aquaculture ponds, and the private sector requires a different way of meeting and discussing the problems so we can keep them engaged. All these lessons were documented, as I mentioned, in our bigger report, which will be available at LandLink's website. And there's used. You can go through all the. Oh, thank you. As well, the process was. The process developed a toolkit of participatory coastal spatial planning at the district level, which can be replicated through other activities. And Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, as well the World Bank, which has an investment in this area, is very interesting of replicating the project. With that, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. I found the first two presentations riveting. I'm speaking as someone of the field, but I think we see some themes emerging here. I hope you're all taking notes. I'm taking notes. But I see some themes around household community level participation, engagement with government at various levels, problems of scaling, the kind of authority accorded the community input in decision-making ultimately. So I really appreciate the ideas and experiences you're presenting. And I'm impressed that I think the project really ran from late 2016 to late 2017. So you really achieved quite a bit in a fairly short period. So next I'd like to invite Peter Vet to come up and speak. People who know the land tenure sort of leadership that resides in Washington have known Peter for some years. He's the director of the Land and Resources Rights Initiative at the World Resources Institute. And for more than 25 years, Peter has worked on a range of environmental governance matters, particularly environment, democracy, environment, human rights links. He's closely associated with the Landmark program at WRI. He has conducted research and written on community-based NRM, environmental decentralization, environmental advocacy, and other environmental accountability matters. I'm pleased to have been associated with Peter on a number of efforts. And he's been the lead on the TGCC's Paraguay work for WRI, and he'll speak to that now. Peter.
Thank you, Steve. Great. Okay, so I've been asked to speak about some work that WRI has been doing over the last couple of years in Paraguay, working with meat packers, working with cattle ranchers, and working with indigenous groups and some of the organizations that represent them. If you haven't been to the Chaco, go. It is rapidly changing. The cattle ranchers are moving in. The forest is being lost. The Chaco, or the Gran Chaco, is the largest biome in Latin America outside of the Amazon. Covers 4 countries. The Paraguay portion is about 25% of the Gran Chaco. Most of it is in Argentina. And about 60% of Paraguay in the north and in the west is the Paraguayan Chaco. It's a dry, thick thorn forest, impenetrable. It is high biodiversity. It actually also has some palm savannas that get flooded during the rainy season, but generally it's fairly hospitable, or hostile, I should say. Also very biodiversity rich. So until the late 1980s, the Paraguayan Chaco was held and used principally by indigenous groups. They held onto that land until the late 1980s, when the government of Paraguay, in order to pay war debts, sold large chunks of the Paraguayan Chaco to foreigners, including quite a bit to Argentina. And it resulted in the disposition of most of the indigenous groups that reside in the Chaco, actually in all of Paraguay. The only way that indigenous groups can acquire legal rights to land today, or the principal way, I should say, is for INDI, which is the government agency responsible for indigenous groups, to purchase the land from ranchers and then to turn it over to indigenous people. Today, 95% of Paraguay, all of Paraguay, is in private hands. Some portion of it is in the public protected area. Maybe 2.5% of the land is held legally by indigenous people today. So, there we go. So, cattle ranching, when did that begin? The cattle ranchers, the industrial cattle ranching began pretty much in the 1960s and is now expanding rapidly in the whole of the Chaco. Paraguay is now the 5th largest exporter of cattle, and it has, as a result of that, one of the highest deforestation rates in all of the world. In a 15-year period from 2001 to 2015, we lost 3.7 million hectares of the forest in the Chaco. So it's rapidly changing. Get it right this time. Let me give you some numbers. I can point you to the publication in the far corner that has a lot of this information. I think that's online now already. But this is data that comes from the Global Forest Watch platform that WRI is also involved in. You can't really see the colors very well, but those are pink, purple colors. Those are all the deforested areas from the year 2001 to 2014. And there's a little deeper shot down there on the left side where you can see that they're squares. And that's pretty much where the cattle ranchers are. And that's where the deforestation rate is particularly high. On the far right side, what you'll see is the yearly annual deforestation rate by property tenure. So the top bar is on private property. The second bar is deforestation rate on indigenous land, legally recognized indigenous land. And the very bottom one is actually the protected estate. So there's a little bit lower deforestation rate. The average annual deforestation rate on protected areas is 0.3%, 0.6% on indigenous, and 1.5% on private property. So quite significant. Part of the problem is that there's a very permissive regulatory environment in Paraguay. There's a strong encouragement for cattle, in the west, strong encouragement for soy in the east. There are also, most of the cattle are sold to low market value markets, low value markets, most of it going to Russia without many serious social or environmental criteria. involved. So there's not a whole lot of economic incentive to up the game a little bit. So we began working with what is now the largest meat packer in all of Paraguay, called Minerva. We thought they would be, and they were actually trying to be environmentally smart, in part because they had an IFC loan that required them to meet their performance standards. 3 or 4 years later, they weren't doing much, and we began to look at this a little bit more carefully. And so what we realized that there's very little information about deforestation. There's very little information about indigenous lands. And so even if a meat packer wanted to understand the land history, the land tenure history, the deforestation history, it was very hard for them to monitor their suppliers very well. The land administration is quite weak in Paraguay. In fact, when we spoke to Indy, can you give us the lands, the maps of the indigenous lands? They gave us a map from about 25 years old that didn't include most of the land that's on there today. So let me so what we did then is we worked with Foppy, which is a federation of indigenous organizations, and we collected the maps and we helped them put all of that information on a platform that made it visible for meat packers, for suppliers, for government, for donors, and so on and so forth. So what I'd like to run through now is just a couple of slides, and I'll finish up that way. So these are the lands that are held by indigenous groups. Again, it's hard to tell the color-coded, but the blues are the legally recognized. The greens are claimed lands, and the purple are the ones that are in the process of being titled right now. You can see the very large green patch right there. That's where the only indigenous groups living in voluntary isolation still reside, outside of the Amazon, still reside in this area. It's owned principally by a Brazilian rancher right now. But the Foppy wanted a couple of other data layers on there, so these are some of the protected estates that are on the platform as well. You can see some of those protected, some of those indigenous lands are actually in protected areas as well. Let me drill down a little bit, because one of the interesting things about this platform is that you can actually get information specific for any one particular indigenous land. So here, again, is there a pointer here? No. If you look at this land here, that's the one that's highlighted, and you can you can get the basic attributes of when it got titled, how much land there is, who holds that land. But you can also then get information about what type of ecosystem is on that land, and this is principally the forest that you see. And you can see most of that land is still forested here. But you can also get yearly deforestation rates for that particular indigenous land as well. And so you can see there was a bit of a spike there for a couple of years, but overall it had a very, very low deforestation rate. Finally, that platform is primarily obviously for Paraguay. But we've also were asked to put this data on Landmark and is now visible on a global platform as well. So hopefully more and more people can see which lands are held by indigenous people. These are the organizations that were involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. It was very interesting. So now we're going to move from beef to chocolate. And we had an event at IFPRI, which hosts me, International Food Policy Research Institute, on Thursday. It was an event on the Ghana Cocoa Board, which I think has some connection to Robert's presentation. And they brought chocolate for the as part of the presentation. So anyway, just mentioning that. It enriched the experience somehow. But I'm really pleased to introduce Bob O'Sullivan. He's Deputy Senior Director, Policy, Markets and Finance, and the Water Unit at Windrock International. Bob is a law, policy, and finance specialist working with businesses, governments, and civil society to address climate change. He's done some very interesting work on the extent to which the private sector investment contributions to the national commitments on climate are reflected in those reports, those studies. He has particular expertise in land use and forestry, where he's a leading contributor to the ideas that help shape the UN FCC decisions on REDD. And so he's going to be talking about, as I suggested, TGCC's very interesting work on the cocoa sector in Ghana. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Steve. And so apologies in advance, I didn't bring any samples. However, and if you go into most stores around and pick up some Hershey's chocolate, you'll be eating Ghanaian chocolate. So I'll be talking about, similar to the talk about the Chaco, around deforestation and tenure and the linkages that exist there. And so this little mini pilot under TGCC came about through USAID supporting the Tropical Forest Alliance 2020. And so we were trying to identify where there are issues of tenure and deforestation connected with private sector involvement. And so the pilot came about through working with Hershey's and then also their supplier in Ghana, Ecom Trading. Where's my... It works. Excellent. So what's the story in Ghana? So cocoa is an important driver of deforestation in Ghana, amongst other sources of deforestation. And Ghana is the second largest cocoa producer in the world. And some of the deforestation is associated with expansion of cocoa production. There's a historic pattern of expanding cocoa production out. And then there's also another issue associated with removal of shade trees from the cocoa growing areas. And that removal of shade trees often also comes up either as a forest degradation or as a deforestation. And so the government, as well as private sector, are trying to respond to the drivers of deforestation within the cocoa growing areas. And some of their efforts around addressing deforestation and changing it around is to try and increase productivity of existing cocoa farms. So what's actually happening in practice at the moment in Ghana around the productivity side of things? So unfortunately, yields are decreasing. So yields have been historically decreasing for a number of years now in Ghana. And there's a couple of reasons why that's happening. Primarily, a lot of the cocoa trees in Ghana are over 25, 30, 50 years old. And after a cocoa tree passes 25 years, its yields start to drop off. We did some early mapping of farms that Hershey sources from, and over 95% of their farms where they buy from are over 25 years old. Another issue in Ghana is also there's disease in a lot of the cocoa farms. These are in particular in those very same farms where the shade trees have been removed. And so the solution is, well, let's try and increase these yields. Let's try and increase the productivity of cocoa farms. But it's not a very simple solution to just increase productivity. And there's a whole interconnected set of barriers that make it hard to increase yields. And the pilot that we did in Ghana looked at all of these different barriers. So on the finance side, there's issues with if you cut and replant a cocoa tree, you've got at least 5 years before that cocoa comes into productivity and you start to get income from the cocoa. On the knowledge and input side of things, there's a lack of knowledge on best or newer agroforestry practices and how to properly establish a quasi-commercial cocoa farm. On the input side, there's a lack of access to newer seedlings of different hybrids that are disease resistant and high yielding. But what I'll be talking about in this presentation is on the tenure side of things. And so on the main tenure barrier is a general tenure insecurity within cocoa farms. And there's also another tenure issue with tenure to shade trees. So the tenure insecurity at the farm level is there is a certain number of farmers. If you look top right here, there is a certain number of farmers in Ghana whereby the type of customary land rights they have is an oral agreement that was made perhaps a generation or two ago that gave them a right to farm a certain cocoa farm. If these farmers then cut those trees, the landlord potentially can kick them off the land. And so, they have an agreement based on farming this farm. So, if you're going to cut your farm and risk getting evicted, chances are most people are going to stay on that one farm, even if the yield is very low and you're only just eking by. And so we identified a community where we were working. And those two pie charts are from just a household level survey just within the one community. And so you can't really extrapolate this to all of Ghana because it's a very diverse situation on the ground. But at least in the community where we were working, you can see that wedge that I took out in the top left there. That represents the number of farmers that had some degree of tenure insecurity associated with their land. So there would be ones that could potentially get evicted if they tried to cut and replant their land. But very interesting, in comparison, these same group of farmers, if you look at the pie chart down the bottom there, this is a representation of farmers that were saying that they considered documentation of their land rights being an important connection to increasing yield, increasing productivity. So you can see that a lot of farmers that don't have that type of tenure insecurity still valued and thought land tenure documentation was important to them to help increase their productivity. And so given the situation that increasing tenure security and documentation is important, what's the barrier to that happening? Well, this is a picture of a customary land secretariat that we visited earlier on when we were scoping out the project. And this is one of the few that's still there. So this is a functioning customary land secretariat. As you can see, piles of paperwork, it's probably not very functional. In many other places, including where the pilot site is, there wasn't even a customary land secretariat. There is the Lands Commission, which can register documentation, but they have very strict requirements around mapping. Has to be within a couple of centimeter precision for the boundaries, and that might be sensible for an urban environment, but for a rural context, it just doesn't make sense. And the price point then puts it out of range for farmers. So in essence, it's very difficult to try and navigate and get formal recognition. And so, what was our approach to trying to work with farmers? And so the first was we worked, through the existing customary system. So we worked with the chiefs in the village and of the main chieftaincy where we were working. And then we also worked through focus group discussions to try and identify what the nature of those customary rights are within the community where we were working. And so, an important part of the pilot is that we documented existing customary rights. We didn't try and convert customary rights into a statutory type of right. And we'd seen this in other pilots in Ghana where that conversion had caused a lot of conflict. So we were just documenting what the farmers, what the customary situation actually is on the ground. We identified 3 different types of land tenure arrangements that were operating within the community. Interestingly, one of them was a type of customary right that we hadn't come across before when doing literature research going into it. And then we went along and mapped the different farm boundaries using a different approach to what would be needed to meet the the Lands Commission requirements, and kind of a fit-for-purpose approach to try and show that you can map and document farm-level boundaries in a way that you might not get the centimeter by centimeter resolution, but you get something that actually works and the communities will know and respect. Another part of what we did on the pilot was dispute resolution system. So we worked again through the customary system, and they have a hierarchical approach for resolving disputes. And here we worked there to strengthen that situation and educate the relevant stakeholders around some of the issues around land rights, tree rights. And here is an example of one of the farmers that we met during one of the field works, Isaac. He was having a dispute with his landlord. He was one of these immigrant farmers that had insecure rights to his farm, potentially getting evicted if he tried to replant his farm. But then through the project and through working through the dispute resolution system that existed already within the community, at the end of the day, he did get his documentation to his farm. So what did this documentation look like at the end? So at the end of the day, the farmers that were involved in the pilot, we had 190 odd farmers that had their farms mapped and documented. As you could probably guess, these weren't formally registered within the Lands Commission because we didn't meet those requirements. There was no customary land secretariat to lodge the documents, but they were recognized by the chiefs. The chiefs signed off, and there were copies of the documents lodged within the chieftaincy, given to the farmers, and then also an electronic copy stored with LandMap, which was a local organization that helped with some of the mapping side of things. And so a couple of key takeaways. One is there is clear demand for this type of documentation, but there's also clear barriers. Another key lesson is while we had some successes on documenting land tenure rights, we didn't have success on the tree tenure side of things, and that's another whole long story which I won't get into. But there is a process underway to try and resolve some of the underlying tree tenure issues. But some of those solutions include registering trees, and we didn't want to go through a process of piloting tree registration when land registration doesn't work already. And then some other broader lessons, not linked to the tenure side of things, is this type of collaboration with the private sector. I only talked about the tenure side of the thing here, but on the finance, on the rehabilitation, the rest of the pilot, that broader kind of PPP did have a lot of interest and attraction to the private sector. And we're continuing conversations with Hershey's and Ecom around how we can scale up this type of work and bring it forward. And here there is a clear combination of a private side and a public side. The public side being working on the tenure security, on working to reduce deforestation, and there's a clear private aspect around some of the financing for actually doing the rehabilitation once some of the barriers have been addressed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Bob. Matt's really anxious to get up here, and we're keen to hear from him. Thanks for the fabulous, very interesting presentation. On the tree rights, it's very interesting. The state, as you would know, in Ghana, asserted ownership of all trees only quite recently, like in the 1980s, including trees that occurred on a cocoa farmer's farm, timber quality trees, and that was part of an effort to create a sort of a commercial timber sector. But farmers lost rights to those trees, and it's become a very nettlesome issue and problem since then. We're going to talk now. We're going to hear more from Matt about customary tenure documentation in the context of Zambia. Many of you know Matt. He's the senior associate at Tetra Tech and the chief of party of this project, where he has overseen the assessments and pilot activities that focus on strengthening land and resource rights to improve sustainable land management across 13 countries. I think it's been a real record of achievement, Matt, so congratulations on that. Since 2014, Matt has been based in Zambia, where apart from managing this global program, he's been leading the work on customary land documentation in Zambia. So, Matt.
Great. Thanks so much. It's great to see many of you here, including some people who were with us at the very beginning, Mercedes and Tim, who were with USAID at the start of the project 5 years ago. And so it's great that they're willing to come and be here to see how it's ended. And really remarkable, too, from Bob and to hear this public-private sector partnership where Hershey's on its own would reach 75% of the population, and they could achieve their goals without reaching that last 25%. And they sort of said that through this partnership, they really realized that they were excluding a portion of the population accidentally because they hadn't been asking the tenure questions. So I hope we can talk about that in the discussion. But now I want to introduce you to a story about Zambia and elements of land and resource documentation and focus on a really small portion of it. So it'll be a whirlwind tour like usual, but let's jump in. We know that land and resource rights matter for every sector of society, whether you're talking about building a new 5-story hotel in the middle of town or whether you're talking about a farmer being able to protect their rights from land dispossession or from a chief's arbitrary decision. It's important for minerals. It's important for wildlife. If you think about wildlife in Zambia, all hunting concessions, which cover about 20% of the country, have a seven-year concession, which means what's your 7-year non-renewable concession. So your best choice is to hunt everything out in 7 years and not think about what happens in year 8 and onwards, which is strictly a tenure issue at the end of the day. Housing, etc. We started in Zambia with a very simple but difficult question, which was, we have low adoption of agroforestry. There's been millions of dollars of investment in sub-Saharan Africa in climate-smart agriculture, agroforestry, and yet the adoption rate is still about 5%, or was at the time. So the question was, if we secure people's tenure, are we going to have an increase in uptake in agroforestry adoption? Now, I'm not going to talk about that at all here. You're going to have to go and read the documentation from the impact evaluation that USAID did on this, which in some of that documentation is outside as well. So there is documentation on each one of the countries. Along the way, we sort of came across some of these other questions about how do land and resource rights of individual households impact these rural areas and wildlife conservation and forest management. And so we ended up working not only in the agricultural areas, but then deeper, 50, 100 kilometers away from the nearest town. But I'm not even going to get into that, because we're going to focus specifically on the methods for participatory mapping and documentation of household rights. But first, we need to understand who owns the land. Land in Zambia is divided between the state. Zambia was historically a colonial mining colony, and much of the state land was mining land, as well as agricultural land to feed the miners. And then the rest of the country was left to the administration of 288 chiefs who were formalized. And that structure still exists and is actually very strong, similar to Ghana. Within that country of 75 million hectares, there's about 17 million people, 60%, which live on in the agricultural areas, and only 170,000 titles on that state land, which is less than one title per 100 persons, and less than one title for every 4,400 hectares. The equivalent of that would be as if there were 5 titles for all of the District of Columbia. Okay? So that's the scale of the challenge of documentation in the country. 17 million people, and yet documentation at that level. Farmers, it's estimated that only 88% have zero evidence of their right to be on the land. In that evidence, so you wonder whether it's this 1% to 12%, a number of farmers have pieces of paper from the chief that says you have the right to be here, a village headman would say you have a right, and increasingly, chiefs are not sitting in the village and with no connection to society. Many are moving back from working in the capital, from having managerial jobs, and they're starting to introduce documentation types, printing out documents, but very few are spatial in nature, and that's sort of what we're going to get to. But I just wanted to reiterate how property rights is important in this context. Critically important for household investment. How are we going to move from people willing to build huts to houses? How are governments going to raise revenue for self-reliance? Think about how much your children's school is based on property tax, okay? If you don't have documentation, you're not going to get there. And social stability for national security as countries figure out how to deal with private sector investment, but also access to land for women, to youth. Foreign investment has become very emotive. So it's critically important for social and national stability. Well, let's talk about business as usual in Zambia. One estimate would suggest that there's potentially 15 million titles and 5 million titles on state land. Within that, the current rate of documentation, which is pretty steady, is about 14,700 per year. I don't know how many of you can do math, but it's going to take us 1,000 years at the current rate to document the whole country. That's obviously not going to happen. At some point, there's going to be a tipping point and something's going to happen. So that's where USAID's introduction and working with these mobile applications to secure tenure, to develop fit-for-purpose tools that allow us to use workflows, mobile tools, to start to document at a slightly bigger rate while having sufficient safeguards. In that process, it's not just about getting households land rights, but in the process of collecting land rights, you might as well collect where are the schools, where are the roads, where are the community infrastructure that can help support development planning in rural areas. So that's sort of a basic part that in order to get to that final level of everyone knowing or having recognition by government, that you can get there. And at the same time, it's not enough just to have documentation, you have to have the institutions to support them. If documentation always has to happen in the capital city that takes 48 hours to get to, then you're never going to get full reach. You have to be integrating this into local governance. And in the case of Zambia, that's through local institutions and the chiefs. So what does it look like in practice? People walking around with smartphones and really walking a huge portion of the country. But let's not forget the original mobile application, which was paper. And paper is crucially important for people to be able to interact, to see, to have a receipt. We have people coming up with a document that the government gave them in 1995 that looks better than the documents in my bag right here. People value evidence. And frankly, we're still distrustful in many cases of mobile evidence, particularly if a development worker comes and says, oh, don't worry, we'll be back in a couple weeks. So at the end of the day, that leads to individual rights, consolidating them up at the village level to producing a map that the village can validate. And here you can see every one of those little red dots was where they wanted to move a line, or on the left or on the right was to change a detail, a misspelling, a year of birth, or when they actually saw their data written down for the first time, they said, actually, yes, I would like to put my real date of birth. When you came here the first time, I just said, don't worry about it. So giving people the right, bring it back and they'll believe you. And that leads to people having documents at the end of the day. So what did it look like at the end after 3.5 years, all working through local institutions of the Patauke District Land Alliance and Chapada District Land Alliance? There's about 16,000 agricultural parcels covering over 100,000 hectares, with 52% of those having a woman on the certificate, either as a sole owner, a 20%, or I can't remember quite the percent, but the rest had joint ownership, covering 22,000 people. And importantly, unique individuals actually, so some individual had more documentation. Important for future planning is there were 50,000 persons of interest who were associated with that. So what's this land going to look like in 20 years when it passes on? There are a lot of, even though Zambia right now is not considered a land-constrained country, in 20 years it could be. And as I mentioned, as we got there, we had to map community lands to solidify those up so that they're not allocated without discretion. And this was across 5 chiefdoms, 1 very large rural chiefdom, and 4 more peri-urban agricultural chiefdoms, and 650 villages. So if we look at how does that look scaling up, which government is currently considering doing, using some of these tools and adapting to the state program. With the government approach, the current cost is $400 to $1,400. Can take anywhere from 2 weeks to, I kid you not, 12 years. With the approach we were looking at, it was costing us $10 to $40. Now that's without any of the government fees or bureaucracy or administrative pieces, but it is an order of magnitude less. And then we had just this team of 20 individuals in Chapada and Patauke were able to document 10,000 documents in 12 months in comparison to government's process. So, in theory, you could map the entire country for $100 to $300 million, depending on whether you want to do state or customary land, start collecting revenue on those 5 million parcels. Suddenly you're paying back. You can get into service delivery, and then you can start to support customary land management. Looks great, and that's the sort of high-level pitch that's made to the World Bank and to banks even to privately fund this effort the government is looking at doing through their national titling program. But the big challenge at the end of the day is a transparent, accessible administration system. It's no use if you have this document today and if you pass on or you get married if there's no place to update that, or if you decide it's not worth the effort. So we're looking at how to build on top of existing platforms, and one of the platforms we looked at was a health platform. USAID and UNICEF and others are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in health monitoring in rural areas. Why not integrate platforms: land, health, water. In fact, this health water platform is already being used for sanitation, monitoring. Why not integrate services rather than reinvent? I say that, it's much harder in practice because the platform was designed to track health as opposed to track, that's the District Health Information Services system. It was important to keep paper, though, in that process, and also to replicate and register with government systems. And over 4 years, government was willing to put this onto their national spatial data infrastructure. So the keys to success of this particular effort, this small portion of the program, were to ensure administration as part of the land rights documentation. I don't think when we started 4 years ago, we were thinking enough about what happens 7 years from now, 10 years from now, on how do we start from day one to create the land administration systems at the local level to keep this data up to date. Link the documentation to a policy or scaling process. We were lucky that Zambia was just in the process of starting a policy revision after 49 years of not having a land policy, and that's coming to fruition and finalization now. And to work through local partners. But as Emiko said, it's very difficult, okay? Both in terms of technical capacity to manage data, which is a huge piece, to do GIS. Those skills get pulled from rural areas the moment that they start to blossom. So it's important to link through government, even though it's more challenging and slower. So it's great to work through local partners to get the systems up and running, and then by the time government sees it's working, they could be willing to jump on board. Importantly, this program, and I think donors in general, have the chance to come in and bridge the gap between communities that can't talk to each other in countries, because we're sort of seen as outsiders, intermediaries. So the ability to convene a meeting between customary authorities and state authorities was quite a positive, I guess, piece of the program. And then importantly, and this is going to be the tougher part, that the volume required to map an entire country takes an entirely different system, takes different procedures and investments in quality control. And that's a big step for anyone to take. But you know, the examples are getting there. So I don't want you to believe just there. We'll have a couple clips from some of our beneficiaries.
Iwe wamkazi umalibe mphamvu komalomba pamene tina ma certificate ndiye amene izamususa
tifunika olembesa pamodzi ine ni vaamuna kuti patsogolo pako kwati kwakatha oko kapena usathe tifunika kuti aliyese akakhale na mbali yake neneranso tsogoloso la vana kuti mwana wina aliyese akakhale na tsogolo lake paja nthaka
upambana kuti tizichita ine nikafa vana asikadonserana koma yapa na ine ndino wokondwa chifukwa chokuti inu lomba mwakhala nkhoswe zanga zosira vana vaja ufulu ine olo nipite nidziwa kuti nasiya nkhoswe nchani nivimapepala
imbewu iliyonse kuti navika pamunda wanga panthu lomba nishiwe kuti ni wanga palibe wamene asanilanda.
So she's very powerful, as you can see, in the belief that this is sort of hopefully a transformative piece, as long as the institutions support that going down the road. Sorry, YouTube clip. Don't worry, Steve, it's the last one. Okay. So USAID, as I mentioned, matters for functioning land systems, for national stability, revenue for self-reliance, basis for investment, and empowerment of women and girls. It's really a piece of the pie, an important piece of the pie. And if you don't have the piece, you don't have a pie. So that's it. So thank you all.
Great. Well, I think you all will join me in thanking our 5 presenters for the really excellent presentation. Another sort of gift they have given us is time. That is time to actually have a good rounded open discussion. We have, just short of our closing remarks, about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes for discussion, which in my experience is a bit unusual in events like this. So thanks for keeping to time. And you've given us time now to have a real exchange. So could you all come up and take your places at the dais? Thank you. Careful. Great. I have my own questions and so on, but I'm going to hold those back and really open up the session for discussion, if that's okay, for questions from the audience. And I think we'll take 3 questions initially. If you'd like to direct your questions to a particular participant, please do so. Please state your name. Try to focus on questions that can help clarify or elucidate some of the key issues made. If you want to offer a short, very brief comment, that's fine too. So who would like to start? And in the back here, great. And please give your name.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Bradley. I work with VSPS Technology, and I was hoping that you could maybe address what technological platforms you're using as far as documenting registrations and where you're looking in the future, like leveraging blockchain as a technology in particular is something that's being talked about quite a bit right now.
Okay, let's take another couple of questions. So that's platforms, technology. Over here. Here comes your microphone.
Sakura Namioka, I'm just a citizen. My question is, after that tenure, individual person got the title or right to use that parcel of land, how it's going to be restricted? Somebody said, well, I don't want to grow cocoa anymore. I want to try tomato or something. That kind of thing, how you regulate or what kind of requirement? And also that tenure will go to, say, that person's children, etc., more inherit or just that person's only? How does it work?
Mm-hmm. Sort of the question of land use requirements or restrictions associated with tenure. So I have another question. I see Mr. Lewis here, Dr. Lewis.
I was trying to save this to the end because it's sort of a macro question. But you'll remember, Steve, when I was managing the 211D grant to the Land Tenure Center about 40 years ago.
I don't remember that far. I do remember that, sadly. But it's still, yeah.
And but we were trying to take the lessons from the land reform in Latin America to Africa. And we kind of hit a brick wall on the Domaine National, the post-colonial legacy of all the land belongs to the government. And the only way, like 20-some years later, we chiseled away at that was donor coordination. So I guess there's been a lot of donor coordination behind these success stories that we've heard about, and these are great stories. I mean, these are the bread and butter of turning land into capital, which is what the economists tell me development is really all about, is taking that factor to production. But I only heard about one donor in the middle of all those presentations. Mm-hmm. And usually, even if someone in the government, in some ministry, really believes in this stuff, mm-hmm. to go for it, he's going to lose power.
John,
and he won't be there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he won't
Good
be
point.
there anymore. And the only way to sort of knuckle that down is, in my experience, is to have all the donors in the room together and say, you either do this or nobody is going to fund it, period. And then it happens.
Okay.
That's a question.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
thank you. Yeah.
What about the other donors?
Okay, good.
In my experience, you can't do it without everyone at the
right.
table.
Okay. There we have 3 questions and comments there. Who would like to respond? Take your. Well, let's start with the technology platform question and you making use of those.
Great. I can speak to technology. So from my experience, land documentation, the technology required is very different from land administration technology, which requires sort of longer term elements, like blockchain, although I'm skeptical of blockchain's use from what little I've looked at it. But as far as the specifics of what we've used, at least in Zambia, is open source. We use Open Data Kit. We use Postgres SQL databases in order to manage data. The main reason being is because we were working with organizations that are loath to purchase software or licenses. That includes government in a number of cases. Or if government has licenses, there'll just be a select few. And so it's not necessarily conducive to the large scale. So that was our main approach in Zambia. But I do really believe that some of the tools that are being used in health and other sort of areas of digital development can easily be used in other countries.
Other comments on technology and documentation?
I could just
Peter?
So I could talk a little bit about the technology we used or the software that we used for the Paraguay platform. We have been working with Esri, and we were very interested in developing a set of templates that came preloaded with a range of data layers that could be easily shared and mastered actually pretty quickly. So we developed these templates that we call Map Builder, and literally within a week or two, we were able to share the expertise with a couple of GIS experts in Paraguay to build this platform. And they now can manage it on their own and add new data layers, add more data to it, get rid of data layers, and add some new analysis tools as well to actually analyze the data that's on the platform. It's a very easy template to use, and it makes building interactive map-based platforms a fairly simple process.
Any other comments? Miko?
Yeah, in Burma, I think I mentioned that most of our work was targeted towards local organizations. So we were really looking for technology that was appropriate for them, and anything paid with a fee associated was basically a non-starter. So we were also using open source mobile data collection apps as well as handheld GPS units to collect boundary and land use data, and then our partners were taught how to manage this data and create maps using open source GIS, geographic information software, QGIS.
And in Vietnam, we work with the government and with their community members. They were collecting data through open source platforms, mobile georeference platform, GeoDK, and the government was trained to how to manage that data in QGIS.
Bob?
I guess I'm the lucky last on this one. So on the data platforms, I can't comment on the names of the specific technologies, but there is a definite need for more online or electronic database development for tenure documentation and kind of essentially to build up a registry. We did work with Ecom Trading, the locally based, it's a big international cocoa trading company, and they have their own internal data management system. And so we did build off that and feed into some of that. But in general, I agree. I mean, there are technology solutions out there, and certainly in Ghana, when it comes to the land titling, that needs to be developed. And if I, while I have the mic, just to maybe address the next question as well on, I think it was on a cocoa farmer, if they wanted to change from being a cocoa farmer to something else. So depending on the type of, at least in the community we were working in, depending on the type of customary right that farmer had, one of them, Abunu, is associated with being a cocoa farmer, but other ones is not necessarily associated with being a cocoa farmer. And even within the Abunu type of arrangement, there can be other types of crops, but it's a landlord-tenant arrangement where the landlord grants the tenant land to grow cocoa and to manage a cocoa farm. Some of the other types of customary ones, the farmer or landowner can do whatever they want in there. And in all of the different sorts of customary arrangements we're looking at in Ghana, there is that inheritance right in there. And so, one farmer can pass it from generation to generation. And we were seeing that in the community where we were working.
Is that the tenancy right?
Yes.
The tenancy
Yeah,
right
the
can be
tenancy
passed from
right.
generation.
And this was an important thing around documenting the customary right instead of converting it to a statutory, whereas in a statutory, typically you'd get a 50-year lease, and at the end of that 50-year lease, the lease would expire. Whereas the customary ones can operate in perpetuity, essentially, going from generation to generation, so long as that relationship is maintained.
Yeah, right. And you wanted to make another comment related to the technology platform, Matt, or?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to mention first that open source does not mean free, because sure, you can download it, but to be able to operate it often costs more in time and effort and expert assistance. So we definitely found that, and I think Peter's element of taking, a paid platform and designing it so that it has limited use, or not limited use, but targeted use. I think the second one, just to note that we have been working with Cadasta, which is trying to make land administration more open and on the web, and that's been a fun pilot. I wouldn't say it's quite finalized, our work with them.
Okay, very good. And Bob's responded to our friend's question, I hope. So let's move on to John Lewis's observation regarding donor coordination and what it means for the efficacy of sort of concerted land tenure recognition efforts. Any takers? Yeah, Amiko.
So in Burma, I think I alluded to this very quickly, but in Burma, the EU, SDC, and USAID were working very closely together in 2014 for the development of the national land use policy. And that coordination changed a little bit, but it did continue throughout the evolution of the project. The way the government designed is that they had the EU working on land use planning at sort of a top-down level, and then our work as a USAID-funded project was working at the bottom-up and truly participatory work at a village tract level. And One Map Myanmar, funded by SDC, the Swiss, was working kind of to coordinate and collaborate on bringing lots of different data sources together, so sort of knitting it all together. So that coordination between donors existed on the policy side as well as on the field implementation side, and continues today with the establishment of the National Land Use Council.
Okay, thank you. Others?
In terms of Vietnam, I mentioned briefly at the end of the presentation, the pilot was actually started when the World Bank was negotiating a new project and on forest modernization and working in the coastal area. So that was one of the way how the pilot was seen is a stepping stone for the bigger World Bank investment, which actually is taking shape and it will start implementing at the end of this year. So all those the methodologies, all those approaches developed through our pilot in Vietnam will be taken up from their World Bank project. And there's, as I mentioned, there's the environment, the legal environment and framework is very favorable to introducing and working in coastal area and addressing all this multi-sectoral planning exercises. So there's other donors working in the space and taking lessons and using our methodology.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Any other, Matt?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting elements of that, and one is the nature of this program, which is a global USAID program. So we didn't have an individual country that we were necessarily focusing on at the beginning, and it took maybe a year, if not 3 or 4 years, to find individual specific countries that met the purposes of the contract, but that also had the needs. And I think that donor coordination was central to that because, as Sylvia had said, the World Bank was planning a program but didn't have methodologies for implementing. And we've seen the EU in some other cases say, oh, we're planning a new program, but we'll implement in 2021. Well, until then, the beauty of one of these global projects is there's a gap. Government's under pressure to show movement on implementation of a law, and the other donors are saying, well, we can't act until we have a new program in 3 years. So this global program, we were able to come in with a methodology, pilot it in a couple areas, find out the mistakes, and hand it over. Now, that's good and bad, but I think it's been a useful element of a global program. I think the second piece is in Zambia, that element was working in particular with the National Titling Program, which is a government priority, but then also with the World Bank's Biocarbon Fund investment, which is now going to take that methodology and bring it across the whole province. But I think, John, maybe the difference and the change is that USAID and other donors are not the only ones in the sphere, and in fact, they're pulling out in many countries. Maybe not in Burma, but in Vietnam and in others, the relative importance of donor funds is limited. So you can't just walk into a room and say, we're here, and we have $10 million of investment when there's hundreds of millions coming from other places. So I think that day is changing in how to get other donors to engage in the impacts of that.
Yeah.
Very.
If I could just add to
Sure.
that, I agree that the donor coordination piece is important, but it's always it's often easier said than done as well, with trying to talk with different donors and different priorities and how they program and things like that. But I guess just teeing off on Matt's point there, like looking in the cocoa sector in Ghana, I mean, the donors have one piece and one role to play, but then there is the bigger government interests and then also the private sector interests. And there you start to get into issues of some commercial aspects of competition and things like that, where you have another layer of relationships you need to manage to get things on, moving in the right direction. But at least in the cocoa stuff we were working on in Ghana, I mean, there does seem to be a recognition amongst different private sector, including Hershey's, that no one company can address this by themselves. So there is some interest in trying to look on pretty competitive ways that they can collaborate to try and address some of these underlying issues.
Great. Peter, good.
Sure.
Yeah.
So for the national platform specifically, USAID, I think, is continuing to support that through WWF investment that they have there. And we also worked with Rainforest Foundation Norway, which will be continuing to provide support to this platform at least for a couple of more years. But more broadly, we had an interesting exchange when we were in Paraguay with the director of INDI, which is the government agency responsible for indigenous affairs. And I mentioned that really the only way or the principal way that indigenous people can get their land back is for the government to purchase it from the private ranchers and then pass it on. And we asked, what's your budget for land purchases? And he was finishing up a purchase of land that was mandated by an Inter-American Court ruling. But he said, next year I'm going to be asking for zero money. And it just speaks to the prioritization of the cattle industry and a very pro-business government there. We are about to publish a piece looking at the procedures, actually, of indigenous people and communities acquiring formal land rights and then comparing that with company procedures. And we're finding that this is not uncommon. I mean, just in neighboring Brazil, the government essentially defunding FUNAI, which is the equivalent of INDI in Brazil, responsible for indigenous affairs. So we see this across the board. So the government agencies that are responsible for helping indigenous people acquire formal land rights have limited capacity. And then you compare that with companies where you have the Tanzania Investment Authority or the Uganda Investment Authority, which is a one-stop place for companies to acquire land, formal land rights very quickly. So it's not uncommon, I think, what we're seeing in
Yeah, okay, very good. Let's move on to the, Mercedes, did you have something to this point or another question? Okay, but please, please ask your question, and then we'll take two other or three other. Well, if it's related, then we'll sort of start another round. Go ahead.
Sounds good. Thanks, Steve. So congratulations, everybody. It's really great to see everything you've accomplished in 5 short years. I have a question for Bob, and I apologize, I came in a little in the middle of your presentation, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what Hershey sees as their business case for getting involved in securing land rights. You know, you mentioned that 75% of their farmers are doing just fine, more or less. You know, so what do you see as the role of the sort of public sector versus the private sector in securing tenure, and how, if you can comment on it, you know, how is Hershey looking at this question in Ghana?
That's a great question. Can I take 2 more questions? Because this is
Yep.
a new round of questions. So thanks, Mercedes. This gentleman here.
Yes, hello, Leah Bottrell, Map Hubs. I have a question about what is the next Chaco within the countries that you've been working in. Perhaps you have an example of a sector or a geography or location within the countries you've been operating where there is a clear potential conflict between the interests of industry, maybe at mining or industrial agriculture, and insecure land tenure. Any examples would be very interesting. Thank you.
So that's what's next in the countries you're working in terms of tenure issues. Okay. This gentleman here. We have some others. Okay. Right.
Yeah, my name is Todd Miller. I'm from Chroma Way. I had a question. You sort of touched on it briefly in the previous section, but I guess what's your sense about the prospects for these participatory methods being recognized for formal land tenure? I mean, I guess that's the big question. To what degree will these national governments use the processes that you're engaged in to include these in the national registries?
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to allow for one more question in this round. I don't want to give somebody else a chance. This gentleman over here. Great.
Hi, my name is Rick Rybeck. I enjoyed the presentations very much. Question, you mentioned, I think in the instance of Paraguay, the enormous amount of private land acquisition that took place beginning in the 1980s and afterwards. I'm wondering, are there any grounds for challenging the private acquisition of native lands? I mean, are there any grounds for challenging those acquisitions? Does the government have title? Do they know what they're selling? Did they get a fair price?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So let's start with Mercedes' question. I think it was directed to Bob specifically regarding sort of what's in it for Hershey's. If I can capsulize it.
Okay, so I guess first of all, you know, I can't speak for Hershey's. I don't work with Hershey's. But I guess teeing off the last comment from Rick, I mean, what's clear with Hershey's is they're not interested in buying the land. Hershey's sources its cocoa from Ecom, who has a direct relationship with the farmers. And when we first reached out to Hershey's back in 2016 around collaborating on this, their primary interest was on ensuring a sustainable supply of cocoa. And they knew that yields were decreasing, and they knew there was tenure issues in there that was some sort of a barrier, but they didn't really understand the details of what was actually going on the ground. And so their primary interest is on the productivity, livelihoods of their cocoa farmers, and that's their main interest. Ecom, on the other hand, has got a slightly different commercial interest in it. And so they have their relationship with Hershey's, but they're also working on a farm rehabilitation service, essentially. And that's a service where they would cut and replant an old cocoa farm for a farmer, and essentially finance that up front and get repaid over a profit-sharing system over a number of years. And we help them on that financial model on that. And so their interest was more of an on-the-ground commercial interest. And again, they're not interested in acquiring the land themselves, because, you know, unlike in Paraguay, where I think it was, you said 2.5% of land was owned by indigenous peoples. In the cocoa growing area in Ghana, it's all customary land. It's all smallholder individual farmers. And so Ecom's interest was on that commercial aspect. And again, they knew there was some tenure issues, but didn't really have a good understanding of it. And so on both of those fronts, their interest is understanding, you know, how the tenure barriers impact their broader commercial interest. And, you know, where I think the PPP side of it comes in is that, you know, private sector isn't in the business of tenure documentation or granting tenure rights to farmers on the ground. That's certainly the public sector piece of it, in my view, at least anyway, where you can have that relationship with USAID being more interested on the deforestation, on the tenure security pieces of it, and then Hershey's and Ecom are more interested on some of the other aspects that flow from that. I can keep on talking, but in the interest of time, I won't.
So these relationships have sort of characteristics of outgrower schemes. Is that right? It's not uncommon to see major buyers investing in upgrading productivity and ensuring in providing inputs and ensuring.
One thing with the cocoa sector in Ghana at least is there isn't the same sort of cooperative situation as there is right next door in Cote d'Ivoire and in other countries, and so there is much more of an individual relationships. Of a purchasing clerk sitting in a community buying from half a dozen different farmers within a community, and then other competing purchasing clerks would be buying from the neighboring farmers, sometimes the same farmer within that community. And so there is a history of input finance and some of that kind of stuff.
Okay, good, thank you. And so then we have this really interesting question about the next chapter in terms of, I'm presuming within the context of the countries. You've sort of taken you and others have taken sort of the land sector down a path with respect to clear documentation, greater community participation, greater engagement with the government. So what do you see sort of down the road in terms of next stages, not next steps, really next phases, if you will, with respect to land tenure sector sort of development? Matt, you want to give it?
I'm always willing to talk. Actually, I want to follow on Bob's point because I think we jumped into this presentations without maybe all the context to the program, and in fact, both Bob and Peter's work was a result of this Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 commitments from private sector companies to net zero deforestation, and the interest of USAID was to look at how tenure plays into those net zero deforestation commitments. And I think what Bob was referring to is quite interesting because when companies signed up, they might have been thinking, on the land we own, on the 10,000 acres we own in this land, we can control that. But then when it started coming to account that you have to consider what's happening with your smallholder producers, what's happening with the beef that might move 4 or 5 times during the life of one piece of meat that you're purchasing, those companies are sort of left with a bigger set of questions. And I think that's been sort of the interesting path to take on that round. But sorry, to run into both, I guess, Leo's question and the question on the recognition, I think there's a number of places, and one of them is basic information. A lot of countries you can't get basic information on, in Zambia including, the number of large farms over 1,000 hectares, the amount of the country that's been converted from customary to statutory land in the last 23 years over completely legitimate approaches, but that basic information isn't there. And that's why approaches like Global Forest Watch to consolidate existing information is just as important as going out and mapping new pieces of land. But as far as sort of recognition, I think the Africa context is different from Asia, is different from Latin America. But in Africa, in many cases, we're looking at equal recognition of customary rights at the same level as statutory rights, so that you don't have to convert swaths of customary land into a state leasehold as the approach. And that recognition will help to stabilize some of the uncertainty right now. And in Zambia, we've seen that happen with the evolution of the land policy there, which initially said, let's title the whole country. And then they had to walk back once they got into the social relationships between customary authorities and the state. So it's balancing the state and custom together, and not saying the state knows best in all cases, but also not letting customs undermine good governance or whatnot, or be arbitrary.
And that's in Zambia specifically?
Yeah,
in terms of the next
specifically.
phase. Okay. Statutory recognition of customary tenures. Others in terms of Peter?
Yeah, so I mentioned that most of the beef is sold to Russia, so a low-value market. But you talk to any meat packer, you talk to any rancher, they want to get to the EU, they want to get to the US. They want to get to Japan, which has higher social and environmental criteria. So there is a market push. You talk to the ranchers, though, they just say, "Where's the money? You know, if you give me more money for a cattle, I'll raise that cow any way you would like to." One of the things that we saw was really the problem of first movers. If Minerva was going to move first and not source from certain suppliers, he's going to lose market share. And so how do we bring all of these meat packers together to collectively say these are the new standards that we're going to approach? And that's been a real problem. We are continuing, aside from USAID funding, we're continuing to work with the banks in Paraguay to use both the data that's on Foppy's platform, which a lot of those maps come from the indigenous communities, so they're not official source data from the government. Using that data along with both the GFW data to monitor both issues of deforestation and historical land claims. So there's a lot of work to be done in Paraguay. While I've got the floor, can I just answer maybe the Paraguay question also about history? So this history is not going to sound unusual. In 1824, maybe 1825, the government passed a law that said if you don't have a title or a document, the land reverts to the state. And so all indigenous folks at that time had no documentation for the land. It became state property. And they periodically sold it off, as I mentioned, to pay for war debts. Then the country was ruled 50, 60 years by the Colorado Party, which made it a point to disenfranchise and dispossess indigenous folks from their lands. And so they were moving into forced to sort of squat. What's interesting is that the government is periodically buying land and giving it back to the indigenous folks. But there's a large, large Mennonite community out there as well in the Chaco. And they also have purchased land and periodically given some land back. And the bundle of rights that the Mennonites have passed on is much larger than the bundle of rights that the government passes on to the indigenous folks. It speaks to the issues of land use. But what we're finding, or what you see now in Paraguay, is that you have a very strong and supportive constitution. You have very good, strong and supportive domestic legislation, but you get no justice in the national courts. And so the most effective strategies have been to go to the Inter-American Court. And when the Inter-American Court rules years and years later, historically, Indy has responded to that and then gone out and purchased that land that was ordered by the Inter-American Court. So it's pretty complicated out there.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to just try to bring things closer to a close. And there was this really interesting question on the prospects for participatory methods going forward. They've been piloted, tested, shown to have real benefit in terms of providing better access and recognition in some number of contexts. But they still may be seen as not institutionalized, not part of sort of the planning, a regulatory regime, not mandated. So I want to ask Emiku and Sylvia to comment on this is what's the key theme in our workshop is what are the prospects in your view of the uptake of and further recognition of the value of participatory methods in land administration?
Thank you, Steve. For the Vietnam pilot, I think that participatory approaches, I mean, they're not novel for Vietnam. environment for Vietnam context at all. Participatory approaches and mapping has been introduced to the upland forest, to other different sectors in Vietnam. But in what the pilot brought as a value was bringing these participatory approaches and clarifying the uses and the different rights to the community in the coastal environment. And this is the novel part, and it's always great to see how our community see that they're part of the whole process. So I still see, at least in Vietnam, testing more participatory approaches and more methods to clarify. And I think the other important aspect in Vietnam was that until now, all these targets on what areas should be planted with mangroves or what areas should be used for different uses was coming from their provincial People's Committee or for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. And these targets were not close to what their community are on, and they can see that they can fulfill this target. So participatory approaches from bottom up has future, at
Has a
least in
future in
clarifying and their coastal environment and special coastal planning.
Imiku?
I'll be quick. I know we're short on time. I think the short answer is that in Burma, the prospects for including participatory methods in national registries, it's still really early days on both sides. We had a lot of communities who were really surprised just that we wanted to hear what thought about their own lands, and that idea is still quite novel, according to a lot of our pilot site findings. And then the idea of incorporating something into a national registry, as I think in many of the countries we work in, spatial data for land in Myanmar is incredibly fragmented and overlapping, and they're only starting to get ministries to talk to one another to share land on a One Map Myanmar platform. So there's a long way to go on that front.
Bob, and then I'm going to give Matt the final word. Okay.
Just very quickly on this point on participatory, where it's going, and maybe even the question on what's next around tenure in the country. And just very quickly that, at least in Ghana, it needs to become a political issue of documenting customary rights in a way that makes sense within the rural communities, to actually get that registered somewhere. And until it becomes a political issue, where it becomes something that people talk about in elections, until the people actually get elected into office and until they care about it, it's going to be a very slow uphill battle, in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And Matt?
Cool. I think just the use of participatory approaches, the end game is not always state recognition. These maps and approaches can be used for different reasons, whether it's advocacy, to self-advocate if you're a CSO or if you're a local community. It could be to deal with local conflict resolution. And that's often the case, that there's someone at the local level who has that right. So you can use them for a variety of tools. They can also be used for community decision-making. We're seeing in Zambia, in some cases, government is allocating large pieces of land, and then the investor goes and they find people on that land, and government says, well, now that's your problem to deal with. So these types of approaches, companies are saying, okay, it's worthwhile checking this out before we take over management of the fact that there's 300 people on a piece of land that we're now perpetually responsible for. So I think the approaches are generally well accepted. They can be low cost. There's tools that allow us to see use of land back to the early 1970s. So I think there's an interest. The end game does not always have to be statutory recognition. It doesn't always have to be household recognition. In the case like Burma, where things are changing on a daily basis, you wouldn't want to take the time and effort to go to the household level, because that's going to be too complicated and the land's going to be gone. You need a quick and dirty method. In Zambia, where things are a little bit calmer, it may make sense to go to the household level. where data exists. Let's use that first before we go out and start walking all of those boundaries and find where the gaps are. So it's, and yeah, I think it's
great. Good.
Many uses.
Thank you very much. I think what we've seen in all the presentations and the reflections is this sort of adaptiveness to the reality of the context within which you're working. And if anything's sort of guiding you, sort of, if you will, spiritually, is the notion of inclusion, where people have weak rights, what can be done to strengthen those rights, and working, whether it be in the customary system or seeking some protection and recognition from the statutory system, dealing with sort of immediate issues around conflict, dispute mediation that can really go a long way. I think it's been pointed out in other studies toward actually strengthening tenure security or reducing an important driver of insecurity without having to go through sort of a more formal titling kind of process, which would raise its own kinds of dispute and conflict kinds of issues. So I'm not all that comfortable with the word good enough sort of recognition, but it has some utility here. Let's be practical, let's be resourceful, let's take account of costs as you have, because they're important with respect when we try to deliver the greater benefit to the stronger benefit to the greater number of people. So I think it's been a really interesting session. I think it's been a fabulously impactful program. Speaking very personally, I haven't been invited to evaluate the program, but I've been watching it over the last 5 years unfold in different contexts. I've had a chance to participate in a part of it with respect to some work on mangroves, which is very rewarding. But I leave to the honor and task of closing the session to the patron. I'm going to call Stephen Brooks the patron of the project. He's the overseer and supervisor in the USAID Land and Urban Office. And so Stephen is the Land Tenure and Resource Governance Advisor in aid. He leads the work on tenure and resource governance. You know all these things. He also serves as the E3 Land and Urban Office's liaison with the Asia Bureau. That's why we were seeing a lot of them in Indonesia, and leads the USAID interagency collaboration with the Forest Service and NOAA. So Stephen, please.
Thanks, Steve. In recognition that I'm standing between most of you and the libations out in the reception, I'll try to be as quick as I can. So thanks again to the panelists. This has been a really exciting conversation, and thanks, Dr. Lowry, for this interesting discussion. Thanks for all of you who have stuck it out throughout the whole conversation. As evidenced by today's conversations, the Tenure and Global Climate Change Project truly represents an integrated program that displays an inherent interconnected nature that underlies tenure and resource governance. Whether through the focus on the importance of resource rights for reduced deforestation through improved private sector engagement, strengthened community rights, and locally led resource management processes, or the identification of rights within spatial planning for improved coastal resource management, we are reminded that tenure is largely about relationships between people, institutions, and resources. As seen today, the TGCC project, through its extensive global reach and findings, has highlighted the importance in understanding these relationships and clarifying them through equitable, formalized, and just processes to achieve important development goals associated with economic development and improved resource management. I'd like to note that the research and evidence-based activities carried under TGCC have been quite influential in the way USAID and its partners carry out development work. The program was meant to research, design, and test new approaches, and we have seen how this work has directly played a significant role in forming land and resource tenure-related processes at various scales and within a wide array of focal areas, including but not limited to agriculture development, wildlife management, local governance support, fisheries management, conflict resolution, community forestry. The list goes on. We've only seen a sample of the work that this project's done. Specifically, we are beginning to see where these processes and the processes that are designed and tested by the project have been taken into consideration within the larger host country land administration systems, as was mentioned before, incorporated into new legislations, adopted by a range of actors, including other development agencies, international and local CSOs, and USAID programs. In addition to highlighting the interconnected nature of the work and influence it has had on activities, the program has also demonstrated the feasibility of addressing what is often seen as an intractable issue. As a development professional, I can't tell you how many times I run into the issue of coming against the folks that just say, this isn't really an area or a sector that we can get into. This isn't something, it's too complicated, it's too fraught with uncertainty, and the commitment needed is often not practical. Indeed, the issues are complicated. We all know this. No one disputes that. But the work presented today indicates that potential and sound approaches to moving the conversation beyond these barriers. Now, I had a list of what might be the things we need to consider, but I think we've covered that, and I don't want to, again, stand in the way of the next step. So I will say that I urge you to go to the website. Landlinks.net is where our office and this work is hosted. Again, beyond just the 4 or 5 presentations today, there was work on marine tenure, there's work on the work that Steve was talking that C4 did in Indonesia, there's work in Nepal, Central America on red and tenure. So there's, again, a lot of other work that's been done, and there's a lot of evidence and a lot of information that I encourage you to look up if you have the time. With that said, I'd like to thank the team for their hard work. There's many of folks in the audience with the Tetra Tech team that have been crucial to pulling this through for the last 5 years. We are excited to continue to learn from the impacts of this program and draw from them to improve the agency's work moving forward. To those in the audience, thanks again for participating in today's event. And enjoy the reception, and please give us, I guess, help in a round of applause for the